Hey everybody, David Brenna. Today I am doing an interview with Trey Combs. And so Trey is with us today. Thank you, Trey Combs, for joining us. Trey, tell us a little bit about how you first came to be fascinated. Of course, you're world renowned for steelhead and Atlantic salmon fishing. And blue water fly fishing seems like a leap to a different set of challenges. How did that go about?
A buddy and I were on a tarpon trip to Costa Rica many years ago, and Bob Naheim, who has since passed on, but he asked me if I'd like to try a day of fly fishing for sailfish, and I went, yes, of course. So the fishing for tarpon took place on the east coast of Costa Rica, and then I had there's an airstrip there. So we flew to the Guanacaste province, which is Costa Rica's northernmost Pacific province. It's on the border with Nicaragua. And a lodge there is called Bahia Pez Vela Lodge, Sailfish Bay Lodge. And it was the most experienced fly fishing lodge at the time in the Americas. And the owner of the lodge was Mark Tupper, as in Tupperware. Great person. But anyway, I went there for just a day, and my flies were wrong, the hooks were all wrong, everything was wrong. The flies didn't make enough disturbance to interest the fish, so we cut squares of insulation from a radio that had just been put in the cruiser, that foam stuff. And we got into sailfish. You know, they latch onto a popper. One of the reasons poppers are not a great thing to use on sailfish. The sailfish take a death hold on the popper, and they take off with it, clamping down on it. And as soon as they feel some great resistance and they jump, they open their mouth and the popper comes flying out. They haven't even been hooked. But anyway, it was the most exciting thing I'd ever seen. I remember a 10-foot long sail with his bill between the two outboard engines, and it was like I could have reached over the transom and touched that fish. So the next year, I talked a bunch of buddies into going down to the lodge with me. I went down there for 7 years to Bahia Pez Villa Lodge. And in the interim, Ed Rice at Sportsman's International, he'd been getting Billy Pate, who's a renowned offshore fly fisherman, to come and do talks. And one year, Billy kind of stood him up. And Ed called me and said, why don't you give a talk? And I went, God, Ed, I'm just starting this. I don't know what I'm doing. He insisted on it. So I went and gave a talk. And that kind of started things. And I was on the show there I did the shows for Ed for 14 years.
Wow.
When Ed one day said, I'm going to retire, and I said, I'm going to retire too. So before we did the introduction, we were talking about how they do fly fishing for billfish in the Americas, and they still do it this way. But essentially, they tease the fish in, the teasers are pulled out of the way, and the boat is taken out of gear, and the guy makes a cast, and he hopefully hooks the fish. And the fish jumps all over the ocean. And when the fish is totally exhausted and he's 500 yards away, the captain begins backing down on the fish, and the angler reels like crazy. And it takes quite some time to gather up the backing, because you've got this one-on-one gear ratio for your reel. When you finally get near the fish is completely revived, but it's on the surface.
You start off.
The captain then backs down on the fish until the fish sounds. So now you've got a fly rod that's limber. You've got a fish that's a couple hundred feet below the surface. And if you've ever seen a sailfish from up above, he's got these huge pectoral fins. It looks like an airplane. And he tools around on those huge fins. And you're trying to, we were first doing 12-foot weights, which are horrible. But even with 15, 16 weights, my Thomas & Thomas 16 weight was the rod that I used for so many of the billfish, but it's a fabulous rod that Tom Dorsey built. The client is looking down over the transom trying to derrick this huge fish off the bottom of the ocean. And the fight goes on and on and on. So fast forward, during my years of long range fly fishing out of San Diego, we got into a phenomenal number of billfish. These would be striped marlin, sailfish, very rare.
Did the captains of those boats understand the challenges of bringing fly fishermen aboard initially, or did they have to kind of learn a new strategy for these sportsmen?
Backing down on the fish and letting the fly fishermen try to have at it. That's the only strategy they knew.
Okay.
I'll tell you a quick story after I explain this. But on the long range trips, we were busting up rods. 3-piece rods were especially vulnerable to breakage. The break would occur below the second ferrule, between the butt section and the middle section. You get a break there, and they were like kindling after a while in a box by the gangway. And so the engine room guy said, Trey, why don't you follow those fish instead of backing down over the top of them? So we tried that, and I discovered that if you back down on the fish, they sound. They'll go down. We're in a little rubber skiffs. Well, they're 16 feet long, and they're powered by a good size outboard. So the fish would be in front of us when we started off, and they'd be hundreds of yards out with the Spectra backing. And there'd be a angle almost horizontal to the ocean that would lead to the fish. So we'd be reeling and pumping and reeling and pumping, and the fish would eventually hear the engine, be critically aware that the engine was getting near, and the fish would go down. Here's what happened. I'll never forget the day when I did that, and the fish went down, and we cut the engine again. We cut the engine of the outboard, and we waited. And the reel paid out 100 yards, 150 yards, and about 200 yards. Fish was out about 600 feet. I couldn't believe it, but the angle began to change, and the fish was up on the surface again.
Wow.
And that was a breakthrough that is now understood all through the fly fishing world.
As a method to bring the fish close enough to gaff it.
If the line is over the fish's back, they're pulling. If the fish is 100 feet below you, you're pulling. Fish is over the back. Guys who fish for tarpon keep the line over the tarpon's back and the tarpon are on flats. They're on flats maybe 10 feet deep.
Sure.
So keeping the line over the back of the tarpon is a no-brainer. Well, you can't do that with billfish because they're out in the ocean, and they'll sound. The trouble is, the sounding of the billfish was something that the captain did by backing right over the top of them. When we discovered that didn't happen if you did not get over the top of them, we actually would cut the engine once the fish was in cruise control on the surface and pulling. We actually would, on calm days, we'd cut the engine, and at about 2 knots, the marlin would begin pulling the skiff. And it would pull the skiff till it died. And while it was pulling the skiff, we'd reel closer and closer. And then we'd use the engine, and if the fish even hinted at going down, we'd shut the engine off. The fish would come right back up.
Wow.
It's hard to believe, but as we got into how this was done and practicing it, instead of being on a marlin for 2 hours, we could get them in 10 minutes.
Wow.
The reason was that the marlin was exhausted when it finished jumping. And there was as soon as they were finished jumping, there was pressure on them because they would put pressure on themselves. They'd finish jumping, they'd get up on the surface, and they'd begin moving away. And as soon as they did that, with the specter backing and no stretch to it, they were immediately pulling, experiencing resistance in a lot of it. And the 20-pound class tippet and the spectrum backing, which got thinner and thinner, made all the difference in the world. It changed the whole business of fly fishing for billfish, because they could be fought on the surface if you knew the technique.
Now, there's other blue water species out there, but you focus mostly on sailfish and marlin.
Yeah, the book Blue Water Fly Fishing covers many different species of blue water fish. The absolute toughest fish to land would be a large yellowfin tuna. That was my experience. Bluefin would be the same, and Pacific bluefins are very hard to get on a fly, and I never went back east to get them. So that is a chapter missing from the book. But I could, when we got this technique dialed in, I remember I hooked about 125, 130 pound marlin, and a skiff happened to be available, and the marlin was out jumping all over the ocean. And I got in the skiff, and 10 minutes later, I reached over the side and billed it. The astonishing discovery, David, that we made was that if you didn't time it right to get to the fish to bill it, the fish would get so tired that it would make a final dive, go down and sound a final time, not because you were on top of it, because it was dying. It would go down and die, and it would then become stiff as a board. And you get a 150-pound marlin below you. My girlfriend had one like that, and the mate who was running the skiff and I swear it took us an hour and a half, 2 hours to get that fish up an inch at a time with the rod pointed straight down.
Amazing.
We didn't want the fish to go to waste. We ended up having it smoked in San Diego. Delicious. It tastes like the best ham in the world. But anyway, it's not another story. But yeah, but a yellowfin tuna, I could knock down a 100-pound sailfish and nothing flat. A 100-pound yellowfin tuna is unlandable, pretty much. And just they can, and it also depends. But let me digress for a second. But if yellowfin are in a traveling spool, 60-pound yellowfins can't be stopped.
Really?
They just keep on rolling. And we ran into a school of 70 to 80 pound, no, 80 to 90 pound yellowfin on Royal Star. And we've been down in the Revueltos, and we were off San Benedicto. They closed these islands. They're called the Mexican Galapagos. They've closed these islands to any fishing traffic now, last I heard. But we were, Royal Polaris had just pulled anchor, and they were heading back to San Diego. It's a 2-day run. And we're sitting there, and all of a sudden, a huge school of 80-pound yellowfin came through. Wow. Everybody threw their flies over in the water, and everybody hooked up, and the fish just ran over the horizon. It didn't matter that you could crank the drags down until you're blue in the face. It didn't matter. Drags were full on. The fish didn't even slow down. Wow. I had my leader was clipped by a skiff that was on the horizon. We'd launched a skiff to try to see what the whole thing was about, to kind of explore out there what was happening. And I'll never forget this little pinprick on the horizon was the rubber skiff, and I felt the line go slack, and it was he'd cut it with his propeller. Oh no. Yeah, and the captain finally said, we're not going to get back to San Diego in time for you guys to get your flights. We got to pull these lines. How long does it take you to reel in a mile of backing? It's like,
no thanks.
no.
Talk a little bit about equipment. I know it's evolved a bit since you first discovered blue water fly fishing. And the rods are longer and they're heavier weights, right?
Oh, they're the blue water log rods, excuse me, are 9 feet.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Yeah. If they were longer, they'd kill you. In fact, some of the blue water rods now are 8.5 feet.
Really?
The best rods are always 2 piece. 3 piece rods are terrible. Most people have 2 piece rods. 1 piece rods would be perfect
Ah,
because there's
yeah.
no barrels to break. But
And you're saying so it's at least a 13, 14 weight rod?
well, for marlin on our trips, we were using 16 weights, and I
Man.
rented them out, and I rented out the whole outfits: rods, reels, lines, backing, everything. And the
And
fly
you
line,
mentioned,
Jimmy Vincent and I had developed a fly line called the Blue Water Line, and I got a royalty on it. Not a big deal, but as far as an industry leader in the fishing and the types of fly lines that would be used here and there, Rio was the leading leader in the field. Very,
interesting,
very clever,
interesting.
smart
And
guys.
what about reels?
With one exception, almost every reel that we used failed. It failed at some point in time. And
Wow.
I heard stories about reels that the designer and the manufacturer said this reel would never fail, and we'd see them fail on the trip. You can't put a people can't imagine the kind of stress that you're putting this reel under.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
it's like the fish are running at 50 miles an hour, and the backing, which fortunately does not stretch, but the backing is wound down on the reel under tremendous pressure, and the the test of your class tippet, which would be 23 pounds, is more than you'd think. 23 pounds is a huge amount of stress on a fly reel.
Yeah.
Uh,
I can imagine.
I used
I
a Charlton 9500 reel,
okay.
and Jack had taken the reel back and redesigned a closed uh, drag system. Once he did that, that was a reel that never failed for me.
Wow.
And the other reel, Dave McNeese, designed a couple blue water reels just for the fun of it. And his reel was the drag was made with the kind of ceramic shield material they use in the space capsule on reentry. I don't know how Dave got a hold of it, but those
Hmm.
two reels never failed. Just about every other one did at one
Wow.
time.
Wow. So I've read enough to know that the streamer flies that are often used for blue water fly fishing are huge, like 10, 12 inches is pretty common.
Yeah, they can be really huge, but you got to be able to cast them. And
Uh,
it it comes as a real embarrassment. I've seen this happen, not once, but quite a few times, where a guy comes on board with some of these flies that are 12 inches long, and they look like a chicken got tied to that fly. And they get the fly soaked, and they can't get out of the water.
oh,
They
no.
can't cast it.
Well,
Uh,
as a casting person, I completely understand that. The smaller the fly and the less resistant and heavy it is, the easier it is to cast. I can't imagine trying to cast a big fly like that.
the flies we fished with were mostly about 8 inches long, and they were
Okay.
all built with synthetic materials. And the flies that I tied and fished, pretty labor intensive, but they all had a pearl flashabou on the inside of the fly, and then bucktail was used on the to veil the pearl flashabou, and then it's a pearl piping that has a cotton core to it, and you pull the cotton core out. And I slipped it over the head of the fly and tied it down, and then coated it with epoxy. So the head of the fly, and then I had an eye put on the fly, and I'd paint the head very carefully. The result was very lifelike, but
Yeah.
there were They were very light to cast, even in the larger sizes.
Huh.
Uh, the hook, when we started fishing, the hooks we had were just awful. Some of the people were buying the old mustads and then using a file to resharpen the hooks.
Mm,
But I remember I went to Venezuela to get white marlin, and we hooked a whole bunch of them. We lost every one. We couldn't
mm.
get the hooks to penetrate. And the next winter, I was back. It was in my home in Port Townsend, and I was in a hardware store, and I saw these octopus hooks by Gamakatsu,
Sure.
and they were offset, and they had a curved. I call them beak point, but they had a curved point, and the little barb was way out near the end of the curvature. They were so sharp. So I tied all my flies for my next trip to Venezuela, and these were not the white marlin are only about 60 pounds, 70 pounds, and I tied all my flies uh, on these octopus offset hooks, and we hooked almost every single white we hooked. I got in my partner.
Wow. Wow.
It was,
So I'm
in fact, one of
assuming
them was.
that has that hook been copied by some other
What happened
manufacturer
was
now?
I got together with the owner of Gamakatsu. He was at a trade show in Denver, Colorado, and I sat down with him, and we cut a deal, and he made 40,000 of these hooks. It was called
Wow.
the Trey Combs Big Game Hook, and I'm not bragging, but it changed fly fishing forever. Uh, that hook was a copy, except it wasn't offset. It was a straight version, and the problem was the hook had to go from Japan to the United States, where we paid a duty on it. And then if somebody else wanted the hook, like Australia, where it was really a hook that the Aussies loved for live baiting black marlin, big blacks. And the 8/0 and the 10/0 hook in the fly fishing uh, were were heavy enough to withstand as a bait hook. Well, it had to go from the United States, where we paid duty on it, to Australia, where they paid duty on it from the United States. They were horribly expensive. The hooks were more than $1 a piece. So after a few years, the Australians talked the Gamakatsu folks into bringing it out under a number rather than my name.
Uh,
It's called the S1, the S-12, I think, something like that. And I didn't care. I just wanted it for fishing. It wasn't. I wasn't making much money on it. Um, and that the type of hook that we've used, eventually, it's so effective that now it's used for softmouth fish, including Atlantic salmon and steelhead.
oh wow.
It
That's
it
cool.
penetrates it penetrates so well, as opposed to a straight dagger point, and the barb is very near the end, and if you don't mash it down, it hardly matters. You can it will penetrate, stay hooked. You want to take the hook out, you can just slip it out. There's not very little damage to the fish
Huh,
if it's
that's
not
great.
barbless.
So
And
they
if it,
come in sizes all the way from steelhead all the way up to large sailfish, it sounds like.
you can get a Gamakatsu hook all the way up to, I think, when they bring them out commercially and dropping my name from them, they could go to 10 on.
Wow.
And the biggest we used was for most of our fishing was 8/0, and the most popular size I fished was 6/0. No, excuse me, was 6/0. Oh yes, the size I used most often was 6/0.
Okay. Okay.
And my girlfriend went on. She almost never lost a fish, um, and she fished a lot of 4/0s, pretty small.
Huh. Huh.
That's more of a Dorado hook. But I was with her one day when when a marlin took, she just let it go. No one was trying to strike the fish or slip strike with the line in your hand. Fish just took off. And I made a discovery. Marlin was running away at 50 miles an hour, and the line was dragging. the hook would set in the corner of the fish's mouth, just like it was grease line fishing.
Wow.
And if you, as soon as the fish grabbed the fly, if you reefed on the fish as hard as you could, usually you lost the fish.
Oh.
The billfish's mouth is like concrete. The roof of the mouth is soft, and the corner of the mouth is soft, but every place else in that fish's mouth is as hard as a rock.
Huh.
So, and if you reef on the fish and the fly comes out, they don't come back and get it. But if you just hold the line tight in your hand and the fish spits the fly, it will turn around and eat it again, as long as it has been ripped
Wow.
out of its mouth.
Wow.
So I would tell the guys, do not raise your rod. That will lose the fish. And it's hard to do when you feel a tug. You want it to go like that. And instead, we just try to get the guys, hold the line in your hand, tighten on the fish, let him tighten, let him turn, start swimming away and leaping away. And
And he'll hook himself.
they would hook themselves. Yes, exactly. I was going to tell you this quick story. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He was Chris Evert, the tennis player. It was her husband. But anyway, I went to Guatemala with him, and we did a program. The captain was the #1 captain in the world for tagging sailfish. So we just had to get them close enough to the boat to put a tag in their backs. And I think we caught and released either 6 or 8 sails in 3 hours.
Wow.
We got a couple of sails we got were like 7, 8 minutes.
Well, so the fish is readily available. It's just so difficult to hook and land, it sounds like.
If if you can, well, on the long range trips, David, we had a ton of bait, live bait,
Uh-huh.
which we'd knock in the head a little bit, and the live mackerel would kind of flutter around injured, and we'd toss one after another over the side, and the school of marlin would be right around the boat, surging and get very excited. And we'd just make a cast and strip in the fly, and we'd get hooked up. It was just
Wow.
like that. In Guatemala, it looked like a tropical fish aquarium. There were so many sailfish in the water. They were just everywhere. There were so many sails in the water that when we were trolling a teaser and a sail would show up on the teaser and the mate would bring in the teaser, we'd take the boat out of gear, we'd make the cast. The mate would leave the teaser in the water and the boat would go back into gear, and we'd start trolling the teaser again with either myself or my companion hooked with a fish, and we'd be trolling again with a hooked fish. But the second fish would come in on the teaser so quickly that we wouldn't lose the first fish. Yeah, those were smaller sails than the Costa Rica sails. They were I think 60 to 80 pounds.
Yeah. So blue water fly fishing is actually started, or is it? I don't want to say saturated, but is it a very popular sport now with some of these guides and charters, or is it still just brand new?
No, there's captains now that have spent their whole career catering to fly fishermen.
Wow.
I ran into a guy who makes his business guiding fly fishermen for billfish. And he was telling
Oh,
me one day about how he had just almost got a big marlin. And he was telling me the technique he was using, and I was like laughing. I was going, "Yeah, I think I'm familiar with that technique. Was keep the line over their back, don't push them, don't crowd them, don't let them get down. You got a 250-pound blue marlin 100 feet or 500 feet below you. It's just like light. You're just
oh yeah. Oh,
you'll never
I
get
can't
that fish.
imagine.
Never.
Yeah.
Take the same fish, let him jump all over the ocean, and then put pressure on him as soon as he stops running, and he has to swim against all this resistance. You'd be amazed how fast that fish will break down.
Huh.
Really.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So even the way you fight a fish becomes specific to the blue water fly fishing world. I mean, I know I have played around with lots of different approaches to fighting fish just as a dry fly trout fisherman.
Mhm.
And you know, you're more effective if you understand what you're trying to accomplish. But it sounds very complicated. The
Oh
blue.
no. Actually, no, I got so that I could, you get some experienced captains. I got so that I could cut up and stitch baits and make teasers myself using, we'd troll around a little bucktail and hook some black skipjack, and I'd cut the black skipjack and sew up a bait teaser myself. And then, the skill level was not in the fishermen. That's pretty simple. Once they were told not to back down on the fish. When I was in Guatemala, the captain immediately started backing down on the fish. We told him, no, we'll fight these fish from a dead boat. He couldn't believe it. We went, yeah, we can beat them faster from a dead boat. And sure enough, they were like 400 or 500 yards out. But with the Spectre backing, we didn't lose any fish because they were dragging the line through the water, and they'd start pulling. I remember a day when I was we were in the mothership. There was no launch working, and I had a 60-pound sail in it. Went off and jumped all over the place. We just sat there in a dead boat. Fish started pulling and pulling and pulling, and that we kept a tight line to the fish. And every once in a while, the captain would gun the engine a little bit in reverse, but we kept the sailfish was kept on the surface. And in an amazingly short time, the fish gave up, turned around, swam right by the boat, and we reached over to the side and built it. It was,
Wow.
over so
Wow.
fast. Yeah.
So down, do all of the charters that are doing blue water fishing, have they picked up on this strategy of not backing
Yeah.
up?
Yeah.
That's great.
No, through the Americas now, if you've got a captain who is uh, who is catching and releasing billfish and tagging them for the lodge, he's very experienced in this method.
Huh.
Yeah, the expectations when you change to using this method, the expectations changes dramatically as to the size of the fish that you can take down.
Uh,
Because sailfish,
because they exhaust themselves.
oh yeah, 100 pound marlin. The first marlin I ever caught was on an old Daiwa stand up reel that creaked and was rusty, and it was in Baja California, in Loretto on the Gulf side, and that fish nearly killed me. That fish was on for 2 hours, and
Wow.
and it was over 100 degrees in the heat. And I had this straw hat on. I'll never forget that. I thought this fish is going to kill me. And years later, the same fish on a fly using these methods we developed, that fish would have been done so fast because he would
Wow.
have got a break.
Wow.
But anyway, yeah. But there's saltwater fly fishing as blue water as an expansion of flats fishing or tarpon fishing. All the developments in blue water fishing originated in Florida and the Keys. That's one of the first guys who ever took a billfish on a fly. You know, the old business of a shock tippet being no more than 12 inches long, including the knots, that came out of tarpon fishing.
Huh.
And tarpon have such a rough mouth that you'd never land it if you had to fish a 10-pound tippet tied right to the fly. A tarpon would chew through that.
On. Huh.
So so they decided, what are we going to do about people are going to try, or they have already tried to take a billfish. What do we do about the shock tippet? Because it's not like tarpon, the billfish has got a bill, and that
Yeah.
can wrap around the leader and get in. So they decided, no, we'll keep it. 12-inch shock, that's it, all knots.
Huh.
So, the other thing is, and your listeners will appreciate this, if the fish is in front of you, always in front of you, and he's not down swimming around, he won't get his bill on your leader.
Well, yeah, that
The
makes
leader
sense.
is the leader is down the side of the fish,
Uh-huh.
and it kind of gets burnished by his scales. It gets polished, but all the chewing and all the abrasion is going to take place on the shock tippet, which, as I said, is 12 inches, and including the knots.
So we had a great conversation, and there's one other question that I want to ask you, and that is, and let me preface by saying you are a very, very accomplished fly fisherman through your whole life. And I have to wonder, because I know as I grew older, I got real focused, and we've talked about this before. I became a dry fly trout fisherman. That's all I wanted to do. You still do steelhead and Atlantic salmon, I'm sure, but now you've got multiple kinds of fishing pursuits that you enjoy. Do you rank them in any order? Is there one that you love the best?
Yeah, there is. I mean, Lefty Craig told me that he did the forward for my book on blue water fishing. And Lefty says, Trey, there's going to be a day when you're going to get sick of pulling on those damn things. And that's literally what he said. And you'll want to go on the flats. And because of my back issues, my age, just walking can be very painful.
Sure.
Flats fishing for bones and permits. That's the only fishing where the casting and the hunting are combined.
Interesting.
So you're spotting a bonefish and you're stalking the bonefish, trying to get in position, especially the bigger bones in the Keys. Gosh, there's some huge fish down there, or in the Bahamas. And the guide will see the fish and direct your cast, and you'll spot it. And so it's very tense. It's very exciting.
Wow. Wow.
Tarpon fishing is probably one of the most exciting fishing on earth. Florida Keys tarpon fishing, where
they get big too. So
oh yeah, I've hooked biggest not very big. The biggest tarpon I've ever got was 130 pounds, but that's a big fish.
that's a big fish.
Yeah,
Believe me, I'm
uh,
pleased with a 16-inch cutthroat. So
yeah. The tarpon, the tarpon guides put a huge pressure on the fish, and they do exactly what I do in bill fishing. The tarpon jumps all over the place after it's hooked, and as soon as it stops jumping, the screws are put to it really hard. It never gets a chance to sound, or never gets a chance to rest. And so guys, really good tarpon fishermen, and I don't count myself as one of those for sure. A really good tarpon fisherman can get a 100-pound tarpon in a remarkably short time.
Wow. Very interesting. So I know that we talked about it a little bit before we started recording. So I just want to ask you and share with our audience, when is your book due to be released?
The book is called Flies for Atlantic Salmon and Steelhead. And there's a lot of history in there, and also the taxonomic history and stuff. It's not all dry though at all, but it will be out in June.
Okay.
Publisher is Tom Perrow at Wild River Press, and it's oversized, but it's not a coffee table book. I think it's about 500 pages, all glossy.
The other thing I want to tell our listeners as well is that I'm a real fan of fly fishing history. I think it's rich and interesting, and taxonomy just adds pleasure and interest to the sport, regardless of what species you pursue. And so I want to tell our audience, if you have not read anything from Trey, you have no idea what you're missing, because he also does a very nice job of describing the history that I think is so critical in fly fishing to really enjoy it and immerse yourself in it. So I want to thank you for the author that you are. I want to thank you for the interviews that we've had together, and I can't wait to have another one sometime. I'm sure you've got another topic, and we can certainly engage that.
We can talk about flats fishing, which is, I'm 83, but I think if I lived to be 90, I'd want to go flats fishing. I couldn't stand up in a river with swift currents,
Sure.
but I could stumble my way across the flats and make a few casts. It's warm,
Yeah.
beautiful,
Yeah.
and it's a great place to enjoy an afternoon. If you didn't see a single fish, there's all kinds of exotic shorebirds to see. It's a environment.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
you and I clearly share this passion, because I feel the same way. If I don't hook a fish or even see a fish on the places that I go, it's beautiful country. It's a beautiful experience. You get to see so much wildlife, and maybe you'll even catch a fish.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, Trey.
David,
Very
my
good to talk to
pleasure.
you.
I rattled on probably too much, but I hope
Nah, not at all.
hope folks enjoyed this. And the book Blue Water Fly Fishing is long out of print, but I think you can get copies through Amazon.
I ordered one myself. They just couldn't get it delivered in the short time we had between the
Well,
last interview
get
and
a
now.
hold of me after you get the book. I'd love to chat with you.
All righty, it's a deal. Thank you,
Thank you
Trey.
very much.